This is Frankie Lynch, Saturn Girl. Like this video and subscribe to my channel. Also comment below because I want to know what you think and it helps me out with the algorithm. But I look completely hideous today. I mean, number one, I had surgery. So number two, I had laser hair removal and I can't put on makeup or shave for several days. But I don't look that bad. Although, gosh, this thing right here, I hope that goes away. Anyway, this is sort of a special edition of the videos and this whole program or whatever that I do because we're in Venus retrograde. And it's a very crucial point in the Venus synodic cycle, which we'll talk about in a little bit. We're reaching the Venus inferior conjunction. And, well, I'm sort of in a bad mood because in true Venus retrograde fashion, I look hideous. Also in true Venus retrograde fashion, I got dumped by the person that I really liked. So I'm a little upset. I'm really sad because I thought it was going to be something. But there's plenty of fish in the sea, albeit riddled with microplastics and mercury, but plenty of fish nonetheless. Although, why am I any different, right? I probably have just as much microplastics as anyone. And then we have to put my 18-year-old dog down. So, right around the time of the inferior conjunction. So this is a somber video, but there are some positive points and overtones. So let's get right into it because this is very momentous. On Sunday, August 13th, we have the Venus inferior conjunction. What is that? Well, this isn't just any conjunction. This is the beginning and ending of the Venus synodic cycle. And the Venus synodic cycle traces the movements of Venus relative to the Sun from conjunction to conjunction. In fact, from inferior conjunction to inferior conjunction. All the planets have synodic cycles, right? But they're different for inferior planets. What is an inferior planet? An inferior planet is one that is closer to the Sun than Earth. So which are those? Venus and Mercury, right? Now, these are different because of their maximum elongation. So these planets, as seen from Earth, can never be more than a certain distance from the Sun. For Mercury, it's about 28 degrees, and for Venus, it's about 48 degrees. So therefore, we'll do a brief recap of the phases of the Venus synodic cycle. And remember, we start with the inferior conjunction here. The cycle always happens, the inferior conjunction always happens while Venus is retrograde. Remember that she's invisible when she's within 15 degrees either way of the Sun, just about, right? Because she's eclipsed by the light of the Sun. Okay? Now, the inferior conjunction is when Venus is closest to the Earth, right? This is when she's in between the Earth and the Sun. So, now after this phase, Venus will station direct, right? And she will separate from the Sun, and when she gets more than 15 degrees away, then she becomes visible as the morning star and starts speeding up, right? She's visible when she's far enough away from the Sun. You'll see her coming up over the eastern horizon before dawn. That's the morning star. And the next phase after that is what's called the maximum elongation. And this is moving west. This is Venus's furthest position from the Sun during the cycle and will be seen in the western sky. So after that, then, the distance between Venus and the Sun begins to decrease. And we end the morning star phase with what is called the morning set, right? This is where Venus sort of disappears into the light of the sun in the morning, right? This is the very end of the morning star phase. And then after this, Venus speeds up to her fastest with what is called the superior conjunction. And this is when Venus is furthest from the Earth. In fact, she's on the opposite side of the sun, so that the sun is between the Earth and Venus, right? So this is when Venus is also, once again, invisible, hidden by the light of the sun. And it's quite interesting because at the inferior conjunction, she's closest to Earth, isn't it? It's like she's imminent. Whereas at the superior conjunction, she's furthest from Earth. It's like she's transcendent. So we have the Earth goddess and the sky goddess in a way. Well, so after that, then she becomes visible again as she separates from the sun. And this begins the evening star phase, right? Where she sets after the sun and can be seen, in the western sky in the evening. And then again, she reaches her maximum elongation, but this time towards the east, into the eastern sky. Excuse me. And then the distance to the sun, between the sun and Venus, decreases once again to about 15 degrees, and she will station retrograde once again. And this is the very end of the cycle, because then she eventually reaches the inferior conjunction once again, and the cycle starts anew, right? So, like I was saying, the inferior conjunction is a very momentous occasion, because not only does it begin and end Venus's regular 255, Venus has an orbital period of 255 days, right? But her actual synodic cycle, as seen from Earth, from inferior conjunction to inferior conjunction, is 584 days, or approximately 1.6 years. That's between those conjunctions. But it also begins and ends her wider 8-year cycle, what some people call the Venus star cycle or petal cycle, where she traces this wonderful pentacle or 5-pointed star, or some people call it a 5-petaled lotus, throughout her movement over those 8 years in the night sky as seen from Earth. So her retrograde pattern, of course, traces the loops of the flower. Now, what does this mean? You see, Venus here is in the heart of the sun, which is cazimi. Cazimi, there's different definitions of cazimi, but it is a planet being within the heart of the sun, an exact conjunction within, I think some people say like 17 minutes or less, and some people say a degree or less, but very close, you see? And whereas Venus typically being under the beams, right, within a conjunction to the sun that isn't exact, it eclipses her expression. It makes it more difficult for her to display her Venusian nature, you see? But with the cazimi, it sort of does the opposite. So, it amplifies the Venusian qualities. Now, what does this conjunction mean in your life? Well, it brings beginnings and endings oftentimes regarding Venusian topics in the area of your life indicated by the house placement. So themes like this, right? Love, relationships, beauty, harmony, creativity, aesthetic. It marks the end of her annual cycle. Well, I say annual cycle, but what we really mean is the synodic cycle. It's not really the annual cycle. It's from conjunction to conjunction. Her annual cycle is her orbital period. But we're talking about the synodic cycle. So it ushers in new qualities The last inferior conjunction was January 9th of last year, 2022. That happened in Capricorn. So what whole sign house is Capricorn for you? Go back and look and see if you recognize anything in your life that was happening pertaining to those house topics or involving those house topics. Oh, well, some famous people who were born under inferior conjunctions. Former British Prime Minister and co-star of Dumb and Dumber, Boris Johnson. Yeah, he's an interesting feller. Oh, and we have 90s pop star and fallen star, Warren G. This DJ be Warren G. Pretty easy when you listen to the G'd up sound. I don't remember this. I was a kid when that music video came out. I remember watching it on MTV. Oh, and then we also have conservative talk show host and famous hairspray connoisseur, Laura Ingraham. It looks like her hair is a helmet. It looks like she can take it on and off like Darth Vader. Sorry. Yeah, Laura Ingraham. Yeah, there's a winner. Well, how about some events that happen under the inferior conjunctions? Well, how about this last one, the one that happened in January? So I read about a 61-year-old mother who was battling breast cancer and decided to take out a billboard in Times Square, New York City, to try and get her daughter a date. You know, she realized her time was short. And, you know, it's a pretty common thing for mothers to want to see their daughters in particular get married, at least in this culture, in United States 1950s culture, you know, although I'm sure in many cultures that's sort of a thing. But anyway, so she took out a billboard. I don't know if her daughter ever met anyone or if it worked out, but it was really interesting that she felt such a sense of urgency. So this story was from CNN. Oh, and then another interesting thing too. This is really wild. Sinead O'Connor's 17-year-old son died after going missing. Oh my goodness. That's terrible. Well, what's really interesting about this is this tragic event happened while Venus was retrograde. And while we were at an inferior conjunction. And Sinead O'Connor herself just passed away while Venus was retrograde and pretty darn close to another inferior conjunction. God bless. Well, oh, here's another one. And you see how these are all Venusian? The first one's about relationships. And the second one's also about relationships, really. And then the third one here, the New Orleans, Nolans. I got some friends in Nolans. The New Orleans City Council unanimously voted to rename Robert E. Lee Boulevard after the prolific blues musician Alan Toussaint. I think I'm saying that correctly. But, yeah, prolific blues musician starting from, I believe, the 1950s or 60s onwards. And I believe he passed away finally, I don't know, 2015? Which is sort of wild because that was the year that we had that Leo inferior conjunction. I don't think he died at the inferior conjunction, though. I should have looked that up. Well, what are some events that happened at that the last inferior conjunction in Leo? Because this one's happening in Leo. And the really interesting thing about it is the last one, 8 years ago, happened August 15th of 2015. This one's happening August 13th of 2015. You see how precise that is within just a few days. That's why the Venus cycle, the Synodic cycle, was such an important phenomenon to use in timing, in calendars. And you'll remember from my last video about the Venus retrograde cycle that the number 40 pops up in the world scriptures very frequently. You know, particularly the Judeo-Christian scriptures, but also Babylonian, Sumerian, ancient Mesopotamian in general. So, But I slightly digress. So here's some events that happened. Well, number one, and this is very Venus retrograde, but Swedish officials announced in 2015 that they were dropping the charges that, they were not good charges against Julian Assange in Sweden, right? Those charges were in fact announced. And Swedish prosecutors ordered him to be detained and issued an arrest warrant. While Venus was also retrograde and about to station 2 weeks after the inferior conjunction. So you see a lot of these things that followed each other, So his charges were initially announced around the inferior conjunction, and they were dropped again around the inferior conjunction. We'll see lots of things like this. Well, another interesting thing too, Venusian, having to do with art and aesthetic. The US government returned the famous multi-million-dollar painting L'Aquarius. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. Don't make fun of me. But the famous painting by Pablo Picasso. It was stolen from the National Museum of Modern Art in Paris in 2001. I was trying to find the exact date because I'm like, I'll bet you dollars to donuts. Venus was retrograde back then. But again, I couldn't fix the date. I couldn't figure out the exact date. So if any of you know, let me know in the comments because that would be quite interesting. And then, also to do with Venusian aesthetic, a New York plastic surgeon, a gentleman by the name of Eduardo Rodriguez. He performed the most extensive facial transplant there'd ever been. This is really wild. And I saw a picture of it. I wish I could show it, but I don't want to get in trouble. So he gave a former firefighter who'd had extensive facial damage the face of a young man who had been left incapacitated and unfortunately brain, right? I don't know if I could say that, from an accident. I believe it was an automobile or motorcycle accident. So you see, Venus goes retrograde and she walks back to repair aesthetic damage out oftentimes. For example, I had my nose broken several times and I just got septum surgery while Venus was retrograde. So you see, going back to fix my nose. Anyway, well, some things that happened to me with this whole thing. In 2015, my marriage got really strained. I think this was also the time, actually, I don't think, I know, this was the time my gender dysphoria started really intensifying again. And I was sort of rationalizing all that thing, with my spiritual beliefs at the time, like, oh, it's past life stuff. Oh, I was just a woman in the most recent past life or some nonsense. And now, at the inferior conjunction in 2023, I don't really care about past lives. I'm being myself now. So, that's a good thing. But look back also, right? Well, we'll talk about more of this when we get to your horoscopes. So, I got ahead of myself. Ooh, I officially separated from my ex-wife during a Venus retrograde. That's interesting. We'll see a lot of stuff like that. Relationships ending. Well, this time, around the Venus retrograde, I met someone during her shadow period. In fact, right when it began. And then she just broke up with me or dumped or whatever we want to call it. I don't know. I feel like a 40-year-old high school student again, I mean, that's what hormones do to you, too. It makes you feel like you're fucking 16 again. Pardon my French, but, I mean, my European friends are going to say, that's not the French, Anyway. Or my Swiss friends. I do have Swiss friends, too. It's so funny because the French really don't seem to like the Swiss and vice versa. Like, you're not really French. I don't know. You guys could probably call BS on me. So, but you see, that's a really interesting thing. And I got dumped, right? Days before the inferior conjunction. And then our dog Maggie. She's 18 and she's really not doing well. And so we do have to put her down, unfortunately, on Monday. We took her to the vet, and that's what they advised us to do. So, but we're doing it all at home, you know. But the reason why I'm bringing this up astrologically is because Venus was retrograde when we adopted her. And, well, actually, it was around the inferior conjunction in Scorpio in 2010. So, within days, I believe. And she's going to be passing during this inferior conjunction in Leo. And these two signs are square to each other. It's sort of interesting to me. And, you know, squares are, you know, they're abrupt endings, so to speak. Or bringing things to a crescendo, a collision. It's very decisive. Anyway, I'm sad about that, but you see, this is the end of a big cycle and the beginning of a new one. So hopefully now, hopefully we can relate this back to you. So pardon me, I'm just really low energy and I'm sad and everything right now. So, but again, think back to 2015. And look back at what whole sign house Leo is for you. Do you recall anything happening in your life regarding those house topics at the time? What's happening now? Did anything carry over? Are you having to put these things to bed, or are they rearing their ugly heads? Are there any big beginnings or endings happening right now with regards to that house? Well, let's do some horoscopes. Maybe you need some assistance looking at this. And I do this, so, you know. And remember these horoscopes. Oh, I almost dropped my magic 8-ball. Remember, these horoscopes are for each rising sign. But if you don't know your rising sign, because a lot of people don't know their birth time, then, you know, look for your sun sign, right? Just look for your sun sign. I know some astrologers will say, look to your moon sign if you were born at night. I think that's what Chris Brennan says. But I don't want to overcomplicate it for people who don't know if they were born at night or born during the day. You see? Well, so let's start with Aries. Oh, and let's go over to this chart over here. So number one, you can see over here how the sun and Venus are conjunct. She's retrograde. She's entering the heart of the sun. And let's go here. Let's go to Aries. I want to be able to look at this with you so you can see. Okay, here's Aries rising. So that means the conjunction here is happening in your 5th house, right? So what happened around children or romance during August of 2015? What's happening now? Again, right? Did you see things carry over? Now, Venus rules your 7th house, right? Here, Libra, of relationships. So it could have had something to do with an ex-partner, right? Maybe something to do with custody because children are involved, right? Now, well, you know, Venus also rules your 2nd house. So it could also have to do with money, gambling. It's also fun. So spending money on things that you like to do and pleasure. Now remember, Saturn is in your 12th house, and it can be very isolating. So settle into the solitude here and the contemplation. I've been through this transit. The pull to self-undoing, we'll say, is very strong, but avoid that. This is a time to consider why you're in the situation that you're in, why you've had to be secluded a little bit. So now the Jupiter transiting your 2nd house should help stabilize your financial situation. Mars, being your 1st house ruler here in the 6th house, it can be good for getting stuff done, getting the shit done that you've been avoiding, but it can also bring little injuries. So please don't rush. Mars rules things like cuts, scrapes, scratches, bruises, and burns. So when you're cooking, Watch what you're doing. Okay? Now, what about Taurus here? Let's go to Taurus rising. This means the conjunction's happening in your 4th house. So look back at 2015 and what happened regarding your parents or your living situation or your origins. Now, Venus rules your 1st house, right? And is transiting your 4th house of origins and all that. So, maybe it had something to do. Maybe something was revealed about your genealogy or family. Has there been something that emerges or, again, is revealed to you? The sun reveals things, yeah? A light shone on it regarding your family history, regarding who you are, maybe even regarding your parents, your grandparents. This is just one permutation, of course. But remember, Saturn going through your 11th house often strains commitments. And it takes away our hope. We have a sense of hopelessness and depression. And we need to learn realistic goals during this time in order to let go of fantasy and pursue something that's more meaningful and substantial, right? We have to learn to be more sober during this time. Now, Jupiter in your 1st house can bring confidence, but it can also bring a little bit of weight gain. So if you have an exercise routine, don't let it slip. Mars in your 5th house is great for sex, but it can also bring conflicts with our kids. So keep your cool and composure, please. Now let's move on to Gemini rising. This means the conjunction will take place in your 3rd house. So what happened with siblings, extended family, or your educational pursuits back then? And what's happening now? What happened with your community? Venus rules your 12th house of isolation and depression, and your 5th house of kids and romance. So did you meet someone at school, perhaps? A partner? Or was there something to do with your kids' schooling in particular? Or did a sibling or cousin have a mental health or addiction crisis? Also remember that Saturn in your 10th house can feel like your life direction gets derailed. I've been through this one too. But then other opportunities oftentimes emerge towards the end of it. And what you thought you wanted to do really shifts gears. Often opportunities you didn't expect. So our life direction often changes. And then Jupiter in your 12th house could bring that healing solitude that you need to figure out your direction and where you want to go with all this. Because remember, the Saturn thing is a 3-year ordeal, whereas Jupiter is more like a 1-year ordeal. Okay. And remember, this is more like healing solitude than loneliness so much. Now, Mars in your Mars in your 4th house can indicate conflicts with parents, landlords, HOAs, or people involved with real estate. Well, let's move on to Cancer rising. So how about Cancer rising? This is the conjunction in the 2nd house. So what happened back in 2015 with your money, possessions, businesses, livelihood, that kind of stuff? And then what's happening now? You see, Venus rules your 4th house, right? Of home, and your 11th house of hopes and wishes and friends. So, did you get a little support from friends and family with your financial situation back in 2015? Or maybe now? Was there something to do with a business? Your business or your livelihood? Or maybe a job change? Your livelihood, the source of your livelihood, could have changed. Now, Saturn is touring your 9th house, which strips away the old and cherished beliefs and values, and it forces us to rethink our worldview. It also delays graduation if you're in school, or makes completing your degree requirements more difficult. But Jupiter in the 11th house brings good luck from people who want to see us succeed. Like, again, friends, benefactors, and sometimes even teachers. Jupiter is the teacher, you know. But people who care about you. Now, Mars in your 3rd house here, in Virgo, right, pretty close to Mercury, this often brings fights with siblings or extended family. It also brings road rage, fights with neighbors, people in your immediate community, right? This is a time to watch harsh words because Mars is what? Pretty close to Mercury here, and they're in the third house. Now, what else is going on? Let's move on to Leo rising. I always say, I love Leo rising. I love, and I still love Leo rising, but I also just got dumped by a Leo rising. And I was divorced from a Leo rising. And I've dated several other really wonderful Leo risings. So I'm not saying I don't still love Leo, but I'm very sad right now. I'm very sad. And so, oh well. And I look hideous. Oh my God. I hope this thing on my chin goes away. Ugh. Anyway. Well, we're looking at Leo rising. That means the conjunctions in your first house. Blah-de-blah, lucky you. Wonderful. You're so cool. You're so cool. So what happened back in 2015 with your sense of identity or your bodily health or your appearance? Well, hopefully you didn't have a mark on your chin. Well, so Venus rules your 10th house, right? Of life, direction, and career and all that nonsense. And then your third house of siblings in school and extended family. So both your education and life direction are highlighted here. Maybe what you thought you were supposed to do ended up being unfulfilling. You know, maybe you were moving headlong in a certain direction and then totally changed gears because this didn't represent who you were anymore. Remember, identity, first house. It didn't jive with your sense of self. Now, Jupiter in your 10th house, this really does help things being an angular house because he helps you reorient your life direction, doesn't he? He brings up those opportunities that help push you where you want to go, or rather, where you're supposed to go. I don't think anything necessarily is supposed to happen. But you see what I'm saying? It's the direction that is more constructive for you, that will result in more subjectively good things. Anyway, that's sort of a mouthful, isn't it? Because then we get into the whole thing about fate and free will, and we don't want to do that right now because that is an unending... well, I should do a video on that, fate and free will. Anyway, Jupiter reorients our life direction, but then Saturn is touring your 8th house, isn't he? That strains our finances. It can hurt our debt situation. But the lesson here is freeing yourself up from the fears and traumas that hold you back. Oftentimes, we're too afraid to live. Oftentimes, we're more scared to live than we are to die. And why? Because the fear, the judgments we have of ourselves, and the concern we have for what other people think of us preclude a lot of the things that we want to do in life. So this is a lesson about overcoming fears and achieving freedom on the inside. Oftentimes that involves a death of how you feel yourself, or sometimes a very literal death in your life. So that is something that happens. And then Mars is in your 2nd house. So that's more strain to your finances. So you need to chill out on spending money. Okay? We have a tendency to spend more. Now, what about Virgo rising? So our Virgo rising friends, the conjunction's happening in your 12th house. Oh my goodness. So what happened back 2015 with loneliness, isolation, mental health, or addiction issues? Think back to that. And is any of that affecting you now? Or does it feel like any of that is coming to a closure? So, well, Venus rules your 2nd house of money and your 9th house of school and beliefs and worldview. So perhaps you had to take some time out from your business or school or spiritual life to reconsider what it all means, right? You had to take some time out for you. You had to go into a bit of isolation yourself. Maybe money, school, or what you believe has isolated you in some way. Or maybe you just had to focus. So sometimes we see our beliefs or our desires isolating us. Now, Jupiter touring your ninth house expands our perspective and makes us more inclusive of other beliefs. So you might find yourself becoming more tolerant, or you might finding yourself becoming more interested in foreign cultures or different ways of thinking. Now, Saturn going through your seventh house strains relationships. Because why? Well, because we've learned to become more independent throughout the sixth house sojourn. And then once we've achieved that certain degree of independence, it's like, I'll do it myself, like Darth Vader says, right? And so we have to learn to relate to people again, because we get so accustomed to doing things together. So if you're in a long-term partnership, you could see those relations get strained. If you're not, you could find yourself really, really wanting to get into one. So, and you'll be challenged on these things. So even though you have the sense of independence and everything, you might find that you either need to turn to people, or that you don't want to be alone. So, and then Mars going through the first house can make us very agitated, frenetic, and also bring little injuries like cuts, scrapes, burns, like I talked about before. So slow down again and pay attention. And now let's look at our Libra rising friends. So Libra rising, this means the conjunctions in your 11th house. So think back to 2015, and if you remember or notice anything happening with friends, hopes, aspirations, goals, or good luck in general. Venus rules your first house here of self, and the 8th house of debt, death, and other people's stuff. So you may have had a tragedy happen with a friend or someone you knew, or maybe you had to borrow money, or they had to borrow money from you. 8th house stuff. Jupiter touring your 8th house also could be cleaning up that area of your life, right? Where you're paying things off. You're attending to debts. You're getting rid of that credit card bill. Or it could be tying up loose ends from a death, right? In your family, oftentimes we have to take care of a lot of obligations and financial things, and you know what I'm saying. Now, Jupiter going through... Oh, wait, hold on. I'm so sorry. I got too far ahead. Saturn going through your 6th house forces you to take responsibility for things and to get your shit together. It's all the stuff that you've been avoiding that you have to do. So this is the cycle where you have to do it, right? And you'll see these progressions of Saturn from house to house as sort of a maturation of our thinking and our behavior, hopefully. And hopefully our behavior is reflective of our thinking, and we have constructive thinking or constructive thoughts. So that's Saturn. And then Mars going through your 12th house often cuts us off from others. And temporarily. I mean, it's a temporary thing, obviously. But it'll give us a short fuse, too. Like, you might not want to talk to anyone, but people will want to talk to you, and then you might bite their heads off or whatever, So, just be aware of that. Now, how about Scorpio rising homies? So, Scorpio rising homies, the conjunction's in the 10th house up here. So, what happened back then in 2015 regarding your career or your life direction? And what's happening now? Well, Venus rules your 12th house, of self-undoing, and your 7th house of relationships. So perhaps a partner introduced you to 10th house opportunities. Or maybe you met a partner at work. Or maybe you lost a job because the 12th house. And something that you were doing, either you got in trouble or you made a scene, or it was something going on in your personal life that affected your work life. That often happens with 12th and 10th house things. Well, Jupiter going through your 7th house will hopefully alleviate some strains with partners. But Saturn going through your 5th house often brings a sense of uncertainty, like we can't just get a handle on things. And so then we have difficulty enjoying ourselves because everything is just a sense of urgency all the time. You see? So the lesson is practicing consistency and follow through. But be sure to schedule pleasurable activities for yourself, because otherwise you'll go crazy. Now, Mars in your 11th house here brings conflicts with friends or schisms in groups. So you really want to pick your battles, because oftentimes you don't want to alienate the people that will help you. Now, how about our Sag rising friends? So for Sag rising friends, the conjunction's in what? Your 9th house. What you believe. Well, it could be university and stuff too. So what happened back in 2015 with your schooling, your beliefs, or your worldview? Well, Venus rules your 11th house here, right? And your 6th. So 11th house hopes, 6th house enemies and illnesses. So maybe you were rejected from an old group or congregation, and then perhaps accepted into a new one. Or perhaps you get help with school. Or maybe you make enemies there. You could see ideological conflicts, right? So, political things. Now, with Jupiter touring your 6th house, though, this could bring luck when it comes to health and conflicts. And you could see some issues get resolved that had been outstanding. Sorry. Well, how about Saturn going through your 4th house? This can strain relationships with parents or make our living situations more precarious. It could bring a certain amount of fear and anxiety around having a place to stay. Can also bring, well, you see, this cycle with Saturn going through the 4th house, it brings a sense of discomfort or anxiety with stability, being able to have a sense of a home, a refuge, right? And so the lesson here is learning to what? Be your own home, your own refuge. And that can be a difficult thing. It's finding a place to plant roots in order to handle that potential uncertainty of the 5th house later. And then Mars going through your 10th house can bring conflicts with bosses, right? So you want to watch that sort of stuff. Excuse me. If you're going to push an issue, make sure it's worth it. Like, if it's a raise, it better be a substantial raise. And you better have contingency plans. So, anyway. Well, what about Capricorn rising? So Capricorn rising friends, well, we've got the conjunction in the 8th house. So do you remember anything back then having to do with death, debt, fears, or losses? Venus rules your 10th house, right? Libra here, of life direction, and your 5th house, excuse me, of kids and romance. So perhaps you had losses in those areas. You can let me know in the comments if that makes any sense to you. I don't feel like elaborating. In those areas of life, or maybe you had to help take care of someone else who had those issues. So if you didn't have losses, with regard to kids and romance or your life direction or career, you may have had to console or counsel someone who did. Now, perhaps you felt paralyzed by fears holding you back from the direction that you wanted to go in. Or maybe asking someone out. Let's see what's on my mind, right? Jupiter in your 5th house could bring pregnancies. You know, it could be a nice thing. Or just resolutions to child issues or child care issues. Or it could bring luck with romance. Those are some lovely things. Jupiter in the 5th house. Now, Saturn is going through your 3rd house, which alienates us oftentimes from our community, our neighbors, family, or oftentimes delays our schooling situation. But this is where we learn to harmonize struggles with the people around us before we put our own houses in order in the 4th house, right? Now, Mars in the ninth house here brings religious and political debates. So again, these can cause rifts in relationships, and you'll want to make sure they're worth it before you get into it, right? Now, how about Aquarius rising? This is me. The conjunction's in the seventh house. So, did you notice anything happening with relationships and marriages back then? I know I did. What about now? I sure do. Right? And I just got dumped. So I'm not very happy. I'm surprised I'm not. I don't know. I spent a couple days crying about that and the dog. So I keep looking at my nose because it's still swollen. Anyway, it's still swollen, but it's getting better. Anyway, so Aqua rising. Well, Venus rules our fourth house of parents and home, as well as our ninth house of worldview and beliefs and all that sort of thing, spirituality. So a relationship could have ended or started to end back then because, well, the roots of it could have been seen in conflicting values, or perhaps family interfered, or maybe you started to feel like a stranger in your own home. You know, those things do happen. Because home isn't necessarily the four walls, although you need those, right? I mean, and you need electricity and toilets and stuff, but it's also what you bring to it. It's what you bring to it. And ultimately, like the Buddha said, we have to learn to be our own refuge, our own home. Anyway, well, Jupiter going through our fourth house could help that. It could be repairing some of these issues or feelings of rejection or being unsupported, whether or not it physically has to do with the home or parents. Really, it could psychologically have to do with that same sense of, again, rejection and not being supported. So, now very literally, you could see improvements in your home situation or better relationships with your parents, or they could help you out in some way. Or, I mean, I really like my apartment, and I just signed a lease again, and I want to keep this apartment. So, well, what else is going on here? Saturn is going through our second house, isn't he? And this brings a lot of anxiety and fear regarding our money situation, right? Our possessions. So we have to learn to be frugal here and to be responsible and save. No more frivolous expenses, okay? And I'm saying this for me too, okay? I'm very, very keen on, certain things. So, and this also has to do particularly with Venusian things, having to do with aesthetic and beauty and art and all that sort of stuff. So, don't go to any auctions trying to buy, I don't know, stolen Picasso paintings, like we talked about earlier. La coiffeuse? I don't know how to say it. I don't speak French. Well, okay, so that's Mars going through our eighth house, right? This brings losses and taking on more debt. And it also brings death, right? And I have a death going on right now with my poor little doggy. And then we also have, I did accumulate some debt. I had to fly my mom and my brother out here. And then the copay for my surgery and, and then euthanasia and just expenses. I've racked up some credit card debt from those things. But hopefully, once Mars leaves Virgo, then we'll see these situations improve a little bit. But then what happens? You get a whole nother situation you have to deal with, don't you? So anyway, how about Pisces? Our final friends are Pisces friends. So this puts the conjunction in the sixth house, right? So did you notice anything happen with regards to enemies, injuries, illnesses, that sort of thing? Venus rules your third house of community, siblings, an extended family, as well as your eighth house here of other people's stuff. So you could have had conflicts with siblings, or perhaps neighbors, or taken on some medical debt. Were there any health complications that arose during this time in 2015, August of 2015? What's happening now? Anything comparable? Or anything tidying up? Well, what about Jupiter? You see, Jupiter going through your third house, it helps resolve those issues, those conflicts with family or people in your community. And it alleviates the burden. So if you are in school, you could see big improvements or dramatic progress. Now, Saturn, on the other hand, going through your first house of self, can make us morbidly introspective. Our appearance changes. Oftentimes our sense of self changes. I came out as trans during Saturn transiting my first house. My appearance totally changed as well. We start contemplating our own death and mortality. We start thinking about the big questions. Who we thought we were gets deconstructed, and we have to face hard truths about ourselves, don't we? It's a thing that happens. Like I said, I came out during my first house, Saturn transit. Now, Mars touring the 7th house can bring breakups and fights between partners. So if your relationship isn't strong on the communication front, you may be in for a rocky time, right? No, for those of you who have your Mercury stuff and your Mercury shit together with your partner, it could be fine. Just watch your mouth. I mean, it's hard to watch your mouth without a mirror, though, isn't it? Well, anyway, I hope some of this was useful and interesting. I know we went for a long time, but it was all necessary stuff. We've hit almost an hour, gosh. So thank you for watching all the way to the end. I really appreciate it. I do wonderful readings. All my information is below in the description. Please like, subscribe, and share. And I love you. You're amazing. And have a wonderful whatever it is that you're having.